Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the Eat Your Content podcast, your home for all things food and pop culture. I'm your host, Rich Herrera. Today's episode is a replay of episode 26. I interviewed food safety advocate and attorney Bill Marler, who was featured on the Netflix documentary Poison, The Dirty Truth About Your Food. Bill Marler and the team behind Poison recently won a News and Documentary Emmy Award for Outstanding Current Affairs Documentary and thought it would be a good time to share this interview with you all again. So congrats to Bill Marler and the entire team for their great work on this documentary. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to Eat Your Content to be notified of when new episodes drop. Enjoy.
We have by far the safest food supply in the entire world.
The safest food supply in the world.
Let's remember one thing. We have the safest food supply in the world right here in the U.S.
It's laughable. We don't have the safest food system in the world.
Cut fruit, cut cantaloupe, strawberries, caramel apples, tomatoes, onions, chicken. All these products are likely contaminated.
It is a very scary situation where you have a perfectly healthy 17-year-old female, and 48 hours later, she's dying.
It was an absolute nightmare. It was definitely from E. coli.
If I buy chicken at the grocery store, should I assume it's safe for me?
Your primary assumption should be that it contains pathogens such as Salmonella and Campylobacter.
There are 15 federal agencies that in one form or another are tasked with food safety regulation.
Food companies hate regulation.
They don't think of it as food. It becomes a commodity.
Profit is more important than ethics.
Consumers would really be shocked at some of the stories that we could tell them.
Right now, the government is not doing enough to protect consumers.
Regulators have the ability to set the tone that encourages industry to do the right thing.
The burden shouldn't be with consumers.
It's not acceptable. If the public makes their voices heard, legislators will act.
I ate a salad and now I have long-term health effects from it.
Welcome to the Eat Your Content podcast. I am your host, Rich Herrera. Thank you for joining our pod. You have a lot to choose from, but you chose mine, so I appreciate that. Just a real quick reminder to follow us on socials at Eat Your Content and at Rich Herrera on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. So follow there and also follow on the podcast player of your choice to be notified of new episodes coming up. I am thrilled to have Bill Marler on the podcast today. He was featured recently in Netflix's Poison, The Dirty Truth About Your Food. He is a food safety advocate and attorney from Seattle. Bill, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I watched the podcast and I was insanely interested in everything that was going on. And so tell me a little bit about your background and kind of the twists and turns that led you to the podcast up until that point.
Yeah, so, I became a lawyer in the late 80s. And in 1993, the Jack in the Box case hit. I'd been out of law school for, basically 4.5 years. And, I wound up representing a number of the kids that were sickened, including, some that died and some that were really quite severely injured. That litigation took kind of on a life of its own. There was lots of legal intrigue and whatnot. But, by the end of 1995, when all of the cases had been litigated, most of them resolved, I was looking around and kind of started to think about maybe sort of focusing on this area of the law. And I started getting referrals from cases, lawyers from all over the country. The Odwalla case happened in 1996, and 1998, I started my own law firm, Marler Clark. Clark was chief counsel for Jack in the Box during the Jack in the Box case. So between he and I, and one of his associates, we probably were the three most knowledgeable lawyers in the world on foodborne illness litigation. And so, we started Marler Clark in 1998 with a handful of staff, and really since then, I've had a great career doing foodborne illness litigation on behalf of victims, but also I kind of tease myself, or sometimes I spend 100% of my time doing that, and then I spend another 100% of my time, trying to convince people why it's a bad idea to poison people, and do lots of work, with organizations. I speak all over the world. And work on legislation and continue to do that. And so, it's become, more than just a lawyer suing people. It's, in my view, it's become kind of a passion for me, to try to help prevent these things. And we've made, as you can see from the documentary, we've made some success, but we've got a long way to go.
So did you think when you were a bright-eyed law student first starting out in law that this is where the road would take you? Like, did you have dreams of Perry Mason, and then the food safety thing came around? It's like, oh man, this is where I want to be.
So I had an interesting way of getting to law school. I was at age 19. I was the first youngest person ever elected to the Pullman, Washington City Council. It's a town of about 30,000 people, where Washington State University is, where I went to school. And on a kind of a lark, I decided I was going to run for the city council against, a town person. And I won by 50 votes, and it was a 4-year term. And for a period of time, and this is 1976, for a period of time, I was the youngest elected person in the state, in the United States. We had just gotten the right to vote only a few years earlier, 18-year-olds did. And so there hadn't been, very many young, long-haired, freaky people, running for office. And I was one of them. And I kind of became adept at the law and politics in that kind of way at a really super young age, really comfortable dealing with media and dealing with, complex issues. And so, when I started practicing law, I started picking up, all kinds of cases, relatively high profile, very early in my career. So by the time the Jack in the Box case landed on my lap, which is kind of how it did, I was really probably more prepared than most young lawyers were. And, the other thing too, and I think most of, you and most of your listeners will know that, if you offer to do everything, most people will just sit back and let you do it. And I've learned a long time ago that, if you want to get something done and you want to lead the parade, you offer to do all the work, and you obviously have to do it. But, that's one of the things I did during Jack in the Box. And good lawyers who had cases just sat back and let me do everything. And by the end of the case, nobody really knew anything other than me. So it was, and that's kind of how it's been since, the early 90s.
Interesting. So how did you get involved in the documentary? How did your name come up to be kind of the face and somewhat the narrator of the documentary?
So what happened was, in, I think it was 2009 or 10, I got a phone call from Jeff Benedict, who was doing a story about the Peanut Corporation of America guy, the salmonella guy that knowingly sold tainted peanuts. And so I was talking to him on the phone, and he had just interviewed Stuart Parnell, and I was in the middle of suing him. In fact, and I don't mean this in any sort of joking way at all, but I was driving him into bankruptcy, and then eventually turned over much of my discovery to the U.S. Attorney's Office, who then prosecuted him criminally, and he's now in prison. But Jeff had interviewed the guy, and the guy had given Jeff his spin on the story, specifically that I was some evil ambulance chasing guy in Seattle ruining his life, And so when Jeff called me, I won't say he was. I think he was just like a lot of people are. People are suspect of lawyers, which probably not a bad thing, but I mean, and so Jeff was like really kind of asking questions, and and I've dealt with the media for years by then, and I was just like, talking to him, and then finally at the end of it, he goes, "How did you ever get into this?" And I was like, "Well, blah 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 blah," and Jack in the Box, and he was like, "Gosh, yeah, has anybody ever written a book about this?" And I was like, "Yeah, people talk about it all the time, and maybe someday I will." And that was the last I heard of him. And so for about another month, he calls me back and he goes, I'm going to write a book about, the Jack in the Box case. And I'm like, yeah, right. Well, whatever. And so then he came out to Seattle and we spent a couple of days together, just like talking about it. And then he started writing it and started interviewing, former CEO of Jack in the Box and, victims and the other lawyers and, the whole thing. And so he started this story, and the book was poisoned, that he actually couldn't get anybody to publish. And so he self-published it. And it became kind of a weird cult classic book in like law schools. We're using it to teach ethics, which was interesting.
Wow.
And then it became kind of a sleeper book, at food safety conferences, and so it kind of slowly over the course of years became kind of essentially a bestseller slowly. And, now it's sold, tens of thousands of copies. It's been republished a couple of times. And then making this long story longer, but probably in 2015, 2016, I got a call from a friend of mine, James Marsden, who's a really well-respected food safety guy. And his son is an actor, James Marsden, and has been quite successful. Apparently he was home and visiting the family in Kansas and picked up the book Poison and was reading it and was like, oh shit, I'm going to do this movie. I'm going to turn this into a movie. I'm going to play Bill Marler. And I was like, so I actually met with him in Hollywood, and a great guy. And the good thing is he's really good looking. So I thought, shit, that'd be the perfect. I was worried that they like have Danny DeVito play me or something. Anyway, that kind of went along for a while, and then it sort of petered out. And then just before COVID, maybe 6 months before COVID hit, Jeff called me and goes, "You won't believe this, but Netflix has contacted me. They've got a producer, a director. They want to do Poison." And that's what happened. And so essentially, and I think it turned out the right way. The first, I don't know what quarter of it is about the Jack in the Box case, but doesn't really follow the book per se. But what it does do is sort of follow 30 years of foodborne illness litigation. But they bring in, people from industry and government and, victims and I sort of, I guess, wind up being kind of the through line between the whole thing, just simply not because I think, there's so many other people in this movie who I think really had great stuff to say. And I think, maybe there were some people we should have had in there that, didn't get in there. But, the fact that I've been doing this for 30 years, I think made the kind of the narration through line make sense that it was me. But, I didn't have any control. This is the crazy thing is people go, "Oh, Bill, you funded it and you manipulated all this." And I was like, to be honest with you, just like my interview here with you, I trust what I do, and I trust my knowledge, and I trust my ethics, and I trust that, that the right thing will happen if you do the right thing. And so I was completely open and honest and transparent with the folks, and but I had no idea how it was going to turn out until it was over. So
well, it was really very, very great, and just very thought-provoking, which got my interest up in wanting to interview for my podcast. And you mentioned the potential of a movie. I think a movie would be great. I mean, Eric Brockovich did a movie, and I thought it was very entertaining. So, maybe we may have to revisit that.
Yeah, no. As long as a guy like James Marsden does it, I'm all good. But that from a personal point of view, as like it was a little shocking to see all the video of me when I was, 32 years old, and now I'm 66 years old. It was a little bit shocking, but the good news is I married my wife 35 years ago, and so she's had to put up with me the entire time. So, I guess it's all good. She still says I look good, but I'll she's paid to say that. But it was a lot of, I think, people have asked me, and maybe I'm presupposing a question you would ask me, but the thing that I really, really, really wanted to get into the movie was the whole thing about E. coli 0157 becoming an adulterant, and that it, absolutely, put me out of the meat business. And, as I said to a lot of people, I said, the only person unhappy with that is my accountant. But, I'm glad that came in and was a big part of the movie, because there's so much other parts of the movie that are pretty depressing. The sick people, the, young girl, the Detweiler's kid dies, all of that. And then outbreak after outbreak. And, the government and industry officials don't seem to know what the hell they're doing. And, but to me, I think the most important thing for me that come out of this movie is that these problems are difficult. They're not easy to solve. There's lots of competing interests and financial interest and stuff. But, if we could fix E. coli and hamburger, I think we should feel good that we can fix these other things. Maybe not perfect, but, humans aren't perfect. And so, but, I just feel like we can keep striving to do better. And that's what keeps me going. I don't have to work anymore if I don't want to, but this isn't work for me. It's I get depressed sometimes, to be honest with you, we're having a listeria outbreak here in the state of Washington. 6 people have died, or just 6 people have been sick. 3 have died. And I've been retained by some of the families, and just to talk to, a woman, her husband died the day before their 45th wedding anniversary. And just go from eating a milkshake, and with listeria tainted milkshake, because the restaurant didn't clean the equipment as well as they should have. And my 35th wedding anniversary is Saturday, and I cannot imagine living my life without my spouse, and to have it randomly happen by a milkshake is, I think that's what, should, I think that's what should people in our business, in the food business, need to pay attention to. They can't be depressed about it, but they need to have that in the back of their minds that, what they do is so incredibly important. So anyway.
Well, let's dive into the documentary a little bit. We'll hit some high points and not go through all of it, but just kind of get people understanding what it's about, and kind of talk deeper into some of the topics that I found interesting on the documentary there. So if you have not seen it, it's streaming now on Netflix. Poisoned, The Dirty Truth About Your Food. It tells the documentary, basically the story is the food system here in the U.S. and who is ultimately responsible for the health and safety of the food. Is it the consumers? Is it the government? Is it a combination of both? And that story is told through some harrowing stories. So we talked a little bit about the documentary opens up with the repeated mantra of the U.S. has the safest food system in the world. It kind of ironically played over and over again at the beginning there. So there are issues with our food supply here in the U.S. certainly. In reality, how does our food supply compare to other developed countries? Is it on a scale? Is it better, worse? I mean, is it really the safest food system in the world, or is that just a billboard saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly a billboard, and it's partly true. And I think that one of the things, the U.S. is way more accurate at counting people that get sick than they do, around the world. I've spoken all over the world on food safety topics, and most countries just sort of use our CDC numbers of attributions of food and illnesses, extrapolate to their populations. They just don't do, many countries just don't do the kind of deep dives that we do. Give an example. I'm consulting on a E. coli outbreak in France that's linked to Nestle pizzas. And it's likely the dough was contaminated, or the flour was contaminated. There were 62 HUS cases. They don't monitor non-HUS cases. 62 HUS cases. We had 70 HUS cases in the Jack in the Box outbreak. That tells me that this French outbreak was probably several hundred people sick, and probably 250 of them hospitalized. So, but they don't count those numbers. I think there are things that other countries do a bit better when it comes to dealing with salmonella. But you see, the import chains that, coming from, Africa or South America, Europe has the same issues. They're just not as big and as necessarily as publicized. I have a case printing in South Africa right now where I'm helping consult on a case of 1,000 people got listeria, 200 died from eating polony. So I don't think that, saying that we have the safest food supply in the world is enough. We just need to, sort of put our money where our mouth is, and need to drive these numbers down, which we have the technology. We can do this. So.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the opening case in the documentary. You talked a little bit about it with the Jack in the Box case. That was the case that sent you off on your hero's journey, so to speak. The part that got me was they sent 4 million pages of documents. And I've seen enough law dramas to know what that's about. They're trying to bury you in paperwork. And did you really read through 4 million pages?
Well, it was 1 million. So 4 million would have been even a bigger channel.
Or a million, right? Correct.
But that's not, that is about 400 Beacons boxes of material. And, I didn't do it all by myself, but I did it with a team of people, not very many, 4. And we just took over, a kind of a conference. Well, it wasn't even a conference room. It was more like a warehouse with a big table. And we just decided we were going to power through every single one of those documents. And, after a while, they started to make sense. Once you look at documents enough, they start to make sense, and you're kind of collating them down, and you're trying to figure out really which box goes which document and things like that. And eventually we started finding things that were just like, it was like, really, they knew that. And so and then that prompted depositions, subpoenas, and pretty quickly, I think it was probably by October-ish 1994, I had sort of finally put it all together. So it took a good, year and 3 or 4 months.
And the crux of the Jack in the Box case was essentially the cooking temp, where Washington State had a higher standard than the federal regulations of cooking meat, ground beef, to an internal temperature of 155.
Correct.
And Jack in the Box knew that, but disregarded it because they said the beef would be tougher or something like that. And as a result, this happened. So So in this one, would you, contrary to the Georgia PCA one, where
Right.
that dude was a jerk, was
Right.
this more negligence and willful negligence versus?
You're right. This was not criminal. I mean, in the sense of knowingly shipping salmonella tainted peanut butter, but under the civil rules of products liability law, I mean, and a hamburger is a product just like a SUV is a product. There and has component parts, and one of the component parts was hamburger that was supposed to be cooked to 155 to kill E. coli 0157. That's really no different than putting a faulty gas tank in an automobile. The automobile manufacturer is still responsible for if the car blows up. And so it's the same thing. Yeah, I mean, they could have a couple things. One, had E. coli 0157 been an adulterant, that the product never would have had E. coli in it. So, and the meat was highly contaminated. So that was a problem. But in 1992, 1993, you knowingly could manufacture E. coli contaminated hamburger and sell it to consumers. You knowingly could do that. And so, there was no rule about it, but there was a rule in the state of Washington to cook hamburger to 155 because our state authorities had the vision to think about how to combat what had been a growing problem of E. coli outbreaks linked to hamburger.
Yeah, and I think the part that infuriated me the most was not the Jack in the Box case in and of itself, but kind of what outgrew from that, where the larger state or federal investigation kind of got involved, and the USDA at the time looked at these parents in the eye and said, "Look, basically, it's your fault. You didn't. You got to cook the meat yourself, and you have to make sure it's safe for your family. There's no responsibility on the manufacturer's side of that. This is all on you to take care of this. So your kid died. That's your fault. That's not the manufacturer's
Hey,
fault."
I deal with that all the time still now. It's like, if I have a case now, salmonella is not considered an adulterant. And, and there's a great quote from someone who was the head of a red meat association back in 1994 when the USDA deemed E. coli in hamburger an adulterant. She says, "Well, that's not fair. You're making this an adulterant in a hamburger, but you're not doing anything about salmonella in chicken." And I'm like, yeah, you're right. It's not fair. We should make both of them adulterants. But that is, as you can tell, even in the documentary, there's a level of frustration I have with. It's not like we haven't made some progress, and frankly, we've made a lot of progress, and we've made a lot of progress in, treatments for children who get sick and for adults who get sick. But I just feel like we could do so much more if we sort of stopped with we have the safest food supply in the world, or we parents should be the ones that, do it, or I should have the freedom to do whatever the hell I want to do kind of attitude. I think if we sort of work together, manufacturers doing a better job, government doing a better job of inspecting, and not to take, responsibility away from moms and dads and, and employees at restaurants, that they need to follow the rules too. And I think that is what has made E. coli 0157 H7 less of a problem in hamburger. I mean, I've told this to countless people. 95% of my law firm revenue in the 90s and early 2000s was E. coli cases linked to hamburger. Today that's zero.
That's
crazy.
Yeah, like you were saying earlier, that's bad for your accountant, but that's good for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one of the success stories of the Jack in the Box case, was the almost complete elimination of E. coli from ground beef. And we mentioned salmonella and chicken, and you mentioned that in the documentary. It's the same exact thing, different bacteria, different animal. But why is it so much more difficult today to do what Mike Taylor did in the 90s about E. coli in ground beef? Why is it so difficult today to name salmonella as a a banned substance.
Yeah, I mean, the the poultry lobby is very strong. There's this undercurrent of still within the USDA that it's the consumer's responsibility. It's not the meat industry's responsibility. There's also one of the things that I think probably came out in the documentary really well is that there's so much disjointed government regulation that we have really no authority to go to like egg producers to work with them to rid them of salmonella. So then the eggs get contaminated with salmonella, then the chicken becomes contaminated with salmonella, but the USDA has no authority over chicken farms. Their authority only starts when they're in the slaughterhouse and when they're being slaughtered. And by then it's too damn late. It's late.
Right.
And so, we need it's a cliche word, holistic, but we need really a holistic look at our food supply, as it relates to salmonella, from beginning to end. Europe does that, and if Bill Marler had a magic wand, I would be looking at salmonella in chicken, just like the way we look at bird flu in chicken. If there's a flock of animals sick with bird flu, what do? We go in, eradicate the flock. I think if you do the same thing with salmonella, over time, you're going to lessen the load of salmonella that's in these flocks that get to slaughter facilities. It's sort of the same idea about why are we still having E. coli outbreaks linked to leafy greens? Look at the video. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to go, wait a second, we're growing this product outside. It's a risk. Doesn't have a kill step anyway. Why are we growing it so close to cattle feedlots? But yet again, the U.S. government has chosen not to take control over those environmental issues. Hey, you and I, if we got to make this decision, we would, deal with these flocks, we would deal with these cattle feedlots, and we would see a significant decrease in the number of foodborne pathogens in food.
That's what I was wondering on the documentary where they grow the leafy greens so close to these feedlots. I'm like, why are we doing that? I don't understand the logistics behind that. If we know that this causes this, then why do we continue to put cows so close to leafy greens?
Yeah, no, again, I'll tell you exactly why. So the cattle feedlots were there and they had been there for long time. When leafy greens started to become more popular as a health, as we tried to become more healthy, and as people started wanting more and more leafy greens, you needed more land to grow, and so you keep moving them closer and closer to higher risk areas, and then when you combine that with also trying to do value added products like wash it and chop it and you put it in a bag. So the only thing you have to do is open it up and pour it in a bowl. When you start doing all that and you're moving them closer to cattle feedlots, you're creating your own worst nightmare. And so it's really, there was no person, no people, no nothing thinking about what was going to happen to, when we started having so much convenience. I'll give you an example. In the 2005 spinach outbreak, E. coli spinach outbreak, 205 people sick, 5 dead. That product was all on one 20-acre farm, cut on the same day. There had been wild pig intrusions into that field. They didn't poop on every single leaf, and had the spinach been, harvested the old-fashioned way in bunches, there probably wouldn't have been an outbreak at all. But you harvested it all on the same day. It went into the same facility. It was triple washed, chopped, bagged. It was shipped all over the United States. But most of the illnesses occurred in Michigan, Minnesota, and Ohio. Why? Well, they spend a couple, 2 or 3 days traveling across the United States in trucks. So, the bacteria got to grow a little bit in those bags. And they got to a point where the infectious dose was enough to make people sick and kill them.
Wow. So I want to play devil's advocate for just a minute, because the documentary really lays out the case for how do we fix this foodborne illness problem in our food supply. And the answer kind of came to be, well, government regulation. We need to regulate some of these industries a little bit more. So just kind of playing the other side of the coin there, a lot of people may be quick to say, it's personal. We're talking about personal responsibility. Like, if I don't want to kill my kid, I need to make sure I cook my food long enough. I need to make sure I wash my leafy greens as best as I can. I don't need the government coming in and telling me what I want to do. So where is that fine line between government regulation and personal responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, that's welcome to America. That's
right.
That's and it's funny. I was just, before I was talking to you, I was talking to a group of food safety professionals, and one guy at the end was like, "Oh, I don't care what you say, I'm still going to eat steak tartare." And I'm like, "Well, if you get sick and you die, your wife is probably going to call me and say, and the defense is going to say, well, this guy knew better. Too bad, whatever." Yeah, I mean, there's a fine line between personal responsibility and lawsuits and stuff. And let me explain something to you. I think it's really important. Is that when you walk into a courtroom, there's 100% liability. Okay, somewhere in the courtroom, there's 100%. And it may be allocated to the defense. It may be allocated to the plaintiff. Depends on the plaintiff. For example, if I'm a 12-year-old kid, I come home from school, I'm hungry, I whip out, a frozen patty and I cook it. And, I do the best I can because I'm 12 and I'm hungry. And I wind up sickening myself with E. coli 0157, H7, because I, mishandled it, or I held on to the frozen patty when I put it and then I licked my hands not knowingly, and I get sick and I have acute kidney failure. Is a jury going to say, it's that 12-year-old's kid, that's all his fault? No, they're not going to do that. But same fact, if I did it, people would laugh, and they wouldn't give me any money. And that's the way the system is designed to work. There's levels of fairness. But putting all that aside, if there is a way to solve the problem so you don't have to make those kind of personal well, I'm going to be fair to this guy, not to this guy. If you can say you can't have E. coli, you can't have cattle shit in hamburger, you can't have, you can't have chicken shit on chicken. And, the technology exists to fix those problems. We can test products better. We can, make sure that cattle feedlots are 2 miles away versus across the street. I mean, there are things that we can do, because ultimately we all have to pay for the burden of these people getting sick and die. We pay it through insurance premiums. We pay it through, they don't have insurance, we pay it through our tax dollars. So we're in this together. We always like to kind of be the cowboy on the range and, the guy living in the woods, but that's not how it really works. We're all in this together, and we all should care for each other and take care of each other. Not fully on nanny state kind of thing. And I get that. But I think where we're talking about are, fixing problems that solve problems. And think about it from the hamburger industry. They didn't want E. coli as an adulterant. They said, the world would fall apart. The Chicken Little is going to have this whole big problem. And the fact of the matter is that it was a blip on the screen financially to them, and they're making tons of money and they're selling tons of product, and people are eating hamburger all the time. So, regulation can actually wind up benefiting the industry. They just don't like to be told what to do.
Yeah, I mean, what a novel thought. If I create some products that, don't inherently kill my customers, then, I might make some more money and not having to pay out on lawsuits. So
it's crazy. So anyway, I think we can do, I hear what you're saying, and I absolutely respect, and I respect that you're doing it as a devil's advocate too. But, I think that's why I think that there's still a place to educate people about food safety. And I think we do a really bad job of that. I mean, I still go out to dinner with friends and, somebody orders a hamburger and they want it, medium rare. And I'm like, you're an idiot. You're an idiot. Oh, yeah, I should be able to do what I want. And I'm like, oh, geez. You get sick and you suffer a stroke and your poor wife has to take care of you for the next 10 years. Don't be an idiot. So
reach across the table and smack it out of his hand, right? No,
I do. Yeah. So, well, that's one of the reasons why no one ever wants to go out to dinner with me. So,
so let's talk a little bit about the some of the champions that you had on the documentary, really championing the cause of food safety from a government standpoint. You had Democrat Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut, really a champion for that. And then back in the 90s was Mike Taylor, the USDA, that put his foot down and said, this is an adulterant and we're not going to have it in our food. You said in the documentary that the power that Mike Taylor had, the current USDA Deputy Undersecretary Sandra Eskin has that power right now to take care of salmonella in chicken and name it as an adulterant, and then we could do for chicken what we did for ground beef. So, and you also had a former Trump appointee, Mindy Brashears, who was a former USDA Undersecretary that, according to the documentary, was basically in the pocket of a lot of lobbying groups. So I'm going to ask this interesting question here because of the way it seemed to be framed to me in the documentary. Which side of the aisle do you feel is more apt to take up the cause of food safety? To me, it seemed like Democrats more than Republicans. And I think because of the question I asked before, right? Republicans are all about personal freedom, personal liberty, and Democrats is about, trying to enact regulation in places that need it. So do you find that Democrats are more willing to work with you than Republicans?
Yeah. So I'll give you a real world example. So, after the Jack in the Box outbreak happened, not only was E. coli 0157H7 considered to be adulterant, but there also was an enormous push to really sort of relook at how FDA was structured, that it was too reactive and needed to be more proactive. And so there are many of the things that eventually wound up in the Food Safety Modernization Act were actually discussed with senators and Congress members in 1994, 1995. And then in 1996, you remember this fellow, Newt Gingrich, when the House flipped and it became Republican, there was no discussion about food safety legislation for a decade. And then when the House flipped back to Democrat and we were having these this peanut corporation and the lettuce, the leafy green problems and, the pot pies and, blah, 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 blah. That's what prompted, the Food Safety Modernization Act. But many of those things that were discussed and became the Food Safety Modernization Act was eventually passed in 2010. Most of those things were on the shelves of Congress members and senators from the 1990s. So but again, that's who's in power. But also too, at least on the House side, the Food Safety Modernization Act was probably one of the most bipartisan pieces of legislation and maybe one of the last ones that we've seen. And so, I always look at it like the reality is, yes, it's true that it's a little easier to have these discussions with, Democratic Congress members, Democratic senators, and Democratic administrations. Absolutely the case. But it shouldn't be that way. I mean, I don't, Obama, said it's not a red state, blue state, it's the United States. And I kind of look at it the same way with respect to food safety. It's like, you could be a libertarian, you could be a Republican, you could be a Democrat, you still can get sick from E. coli contaminated hamburger, And so I think this personal freedom thing is, I think, a little bit of a red herring, that I don't want people to tell me what to do until something bad happens. I mean, I get hired by Republicans all the time whose kid got sick or they got sick. And the first thing they say is, I don't like lawyers. I don't like lawyers. I don't like people who sue. But this is different. This is different because this happened to me and I got really sick. And I want to take every penny from them you can get. And, that says it all to me.
It's not a problem till it happens to me, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
kind of the attitude. That's a shame. That's a shame. I'll be
It's a
honest with
shame.
you.
I think, I mean, but the thing is that, again, I know that the documentary people were freaked out, like, I'm never eating this or I'm never eating that. And I get that. But, part of it is you're trying to shake people out of their complacency. But all of these problems are, not completely soluble, but, are there E. coli cases linked to hamburger? Probably there are. Do they happen very often now? No, but I wouldn't go out and eat a rare hamburger either. It can get, O157 and salmonella or Campylobacter can get through the system. It's less likely today than it was 30 years ago. But, I still think there's more to do. People should not feel like it's a worthless endeavor. Food safety professionals around the world are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to, educate. But I think there's some things that are, in my view, kind of simple to do. We just have to find the political will to get them done.
Speaking of that political will, one thing that frustrated me to no end was watching the interview between Sandra Eskin and Frank Giannis. I think the amount of spin that they were doing was dizzying, just dizzying. And the amount of not my problem that I heard coming out of them, more from Sandra. I think Frank just kind of sat there most of the time. But just the amount of spin and the amount of, this isn't my problem is insane. I didn't understand. Like, when we talk about Mike Taylor, he made a decisive decision. He took action, and through the Clinton administration got it done. And then we're sitting here watching Sandra Eskin have that same power and just be like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Sandy and Frank I've known for a long, long time, and prior to this documentary, I would probably count them as my friends. Maybe not so much.
You had no Christmas card this year.
Yeah, no Christmas card this year. But they in their prior roles, and frankly, I think Frank has moved the needle a lot before he left FDA. I think, his work towards implementing more transparency at FDA. I think, he's done a lot of work, and there's lots of things that the public probably doesn't recognize. And Sandy was a star when her work at Pew, and but for the work that Pew did and the financial support that they gave, the Food Safety Modernization Act would not have passed. And but I think especially someone who sits in a position at USDA, that organization is primarily, its goal driven is to promote U.S. agriculture. And FSIS is like the proverbial red-haired stepchild, and it's kind of like a weird place to have a food safety organization, and it's sort of the same problem with, food over at the FDA. I mean, the FDA is mostly interested, and things that they should be is like drugs. I get it, but food is kind of a second kind of tiered problem at the FDA, and so. That's where I've been, aligned with Rosa for a long time. It's not an easy thing to do, but having a food safety nutrition, agency that is concerned about stuff that'll kill us quickly and stuff that may kill us long term, and with respect to food. And, we could do a much better job of organizing this and giving, industry good guidance, scientific-based guidance, that you work with the industry. And, even, Mindy Bashir's and I kind of agree in many respects that, before you go to regulation, is there a way to have that communication with the industry? The problem is, when do you stop talking and when do you just say, like, okay, we've talked enough, let's get at this, So Yeah. It's it was
yeah,
interesting. I'm glad you brought that up.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think the thing with industry in general, big I industry, is they're never going to do anything until you make them. And that's unfortunately where we are. I think some of that is starting to shift a little bit with like ESG guidelines on environmental safety, and the consumer now has changed a little bit and is looking for those things in companies. How's your social? What's your social philosophy? So again, it's the dollar that's talking, but for most of these things, it's unless you tell us to do it, I'm not going to do it. So speaking of those kind of gaps in government regulation, you have these private companies like the LGMAs of the world and the Tim Yorks of the world kind of stepping in and saying, don't police us, we'll police ourselves. So what you were fairly kind in the documentary, but what's your real thoughts on those private organizations like LGMA? Because, nice guy, Tim York, I'm sure, away from whatever he does for a living, but did not look great in the documentary.
Yeah. So, I think sometimes the best thing that these quasi private industry, quasi governmental entities can do is to try to pick off the low hanging fruit of how to try to fix things, and then get to a point where it's clear that we've come to the time where it's still not working, and it becomes clear that you've got to get a broader based regulatory model that treats everybody or most people relatively the same. And in some respects, I think the work of the LGMA has kind of proved that point. The fact of the matter is like, think about this. The government of Canada refuses to allow California romaine lettuce to come into Canada this fall.
Wow.
And that's embarrassing. That's embarrassing. Yeah. And they require that it say where it comes from. So consumers, and so consumers know. And that has to, and they have to, the only way they allow it in is if they test it. And the testing regime is really pretty rigorous. I mean, when you get back, we have the safest food supply in the world. Well, guess what? We've been poisoning Canadians with our leafy greens for about a decade. And they're just like, okay, thanks, guys. We've had enough. And, to me, I look at it and go, why does that make any sense? Why is the leafy green marketing folks going to government and saying, hey, look, we need to deal with the outflow of cattle feces from these feedlots to get into our water supply. I mean, Google E. coli today, and it's all over the news, not necessarily in leafy greens and stuff, but it's places you can't swim. It's places you can't go, and people getting sick in pools because of E. coli. And, the fact of the matter is we need to deal with that environmental problem, and we're not. Just like we're not dealing with salmonella at the source in the eggs and the broilers before they get to the slaughterhouse. We're not dealing with it. And that's kind of the regulatory mind shift that I think we need to get at. So we stop the need for an LGMA, or maybe we keep something like the LGMA and, use them as, to fix little problems or to be test cases and things like that. But Tim's not going to send me a Christmas card either.
So I want to talk about somebody that really pissed me off watching this documentary, Stuart Parnell and the PCA.
Yeah.
This was the most infuriating thing that I have ever seen, that this guy, and this is different from Jack in the Box. Jack in the Box was just negligent.
Yep.
This was willful, wanting to hurt people for profit, and just was awful. Now, you were involved in this case, right? Right. So tell us a little bit about that.
So there was an outbreak. There was several hundred people sick. 9 people died. I represented a lot of the people who got sick and many of the people who died. And we sued and bankrupted Stuart Parnell. And during discovery, we had learned a lot. And then also the FBI came in about the same time we were there, and collected a bunch of emails that showed that big suppliers, Kellogg being one, that make the little crackers that last for 1,000 years in vending machines. They had certificates of, the required certificates of analysis that product lot be tested for salmonella. And what was happening was the lots kept coming back positive for salmonella. So then Stewart said, hey, let's send out, 5 samples from the same lot to 5 different labs. And sometimes they'd come back negative, and he'd use those negative tests, even though other tests from the same lot came back positive. So he'd use the negative, and then eventually they would all come back positive. And so then they started just forging certificates of analysis and sending the product anyway. And, it really became a situation where the positive tests, instead of dealing with why they were positive, the positive tests became a reason that he needed to come up with a strategy to get around that. And eventually it was like, just ship it. And
I mean, that's awful. Just some real evil villain mustache twirling stuff.
Yeah, it's crazy. And, and I remember for the longest time, I would get nasty letters and phone calls from Parnell family members, basically blaming me for his downfall. And, again, it's, I'm sure Stewart probably is in that camp where, it should be the responsibility of other people, but I'm not going to take responsibility for what I did. So yeah, it was really sad. And, and some really kind, nice people got quite sick and died, and, all from eating peanut butter. I always remember there's one guy, and actually, they had some video testimony of the son testifying about his dad, a triple Purple Heart, either a double or a triple Purple Heart winner from Korea. Shot up, drags himself back, saving his buddies, and he eats some peanut butter and dies. I mean, that's just nuts, so to speak. So just nuts. So
yeah, just to face war like that and to die of something so avoidable. And all the effort that he took to covering it up could have been used to find out what was going on and would have had different results. But he spent so much time and energy and money covering it up.
It's crazy.
I don't understand that.
I don't either.
So one part I thought was kind of funny. I don't know if it was meant to be funny, but you get to the section talking about chicken with salmonella, and Purdue was the only chicken manufacturer that agreed to go on camera and talk. Bless their heart, they did it, but I think it's because they believe their own hype. I mean, they really think, and I've seen their commercials. Their marketing's great. They come multi-million-dollar conglomerate in their advertising makes them sound like it's the farm down the road where you can just get a chicken from your local store or your local farmer. But they believe their own hype. They say, hey, we're taking control, we got this taken care of. And then you go and test the chickens, and they're the only ones that are coming up positive on that very small sample size. And then he's like, oh, well, that's not a fair sample size, you need to test 150. And okay, we'll test 150, and his came out the worst. So I don't know if that was intentionally to be funny, but I thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, it was. I remember when the producer director, they were talking about doing testing, and they were going to do like 5 samples at the very beginning, and I was like, I said to them too, I said, you're not going to find anything. So, you don't probably know this, and most people don't, but back in 2008, I spent $500,000 testing hamburger across the United States to see if it contained other Shiga toxin producing E. coli's. And the reason why is because I had asked the USDA why they, banned E. coli 0157, but not other Shiga toxin producing E. coli's that we knew caused human illness. They said, well, we don't know if it's in the meat. I'm like, well, haven't you tested it? And they're like, no. And I'm like, okay, I will. And I tested it and found that, it was in there. And then I used that as leverage in a petition to get them to change their mind. And so, with respect to when the producer said, well, should we do testing? I'm like, you're not going to find anything. And then when they had Salmonella infantis in a test for Purdue, and then Purdue goes, well, 150 would be a better sample size. And they called me and they said, should we do it? I'm like, hell yeah, you should try and see what happens. And I think I was, as well as the lab, was a little surprised. But again, kudos to Purdue for letting people see how it operates. I think that's good for consumers. But the reality is, Purdue needs to deal with salmonella in the eggs and salmonella in the chicks before they wind up coming to the slaughterhouse. And that's the problem with the industry and problem with government is, that frankly, the industry would be better off if the government said, you have to test eggs, you have to test flocks. And if the flocks or the eggs test positive for salmonella, you got to destroy it. And eventually, we would continue to lower the amount of salmonella that was in those flocks and coming into our slaughterhouses. And why that doesn't, I get it. Personal responsibility and don't tell me what to do kind of stuff. But it's still, I think it's counterproductive to the overall thing. But the one thing, and this is really important, I wanted to say is that, most foodborne illness outbreaks are never figured out. Of the 1.4 million salmonella cases every year, maybe 10,000 of those ever figure out that's what made me sick. So the public doesn't have that sense of attribution. Oh, that's what made me sick. I'm going to call my congresswoman. Most of the time they're like, my kid got sick with salmonella. I have no idea what made them sick. And so that's what makes it, the government kind of knows because they do all kinds of testing and they know what chickens test positive and how that impacts humans, but they don't tell the humans that kind of thing. But, part of the reason why consumers aren't beating the doors down to get change is that they don't have enough information. So
yeah. So I want to ask you something that had nothing to do with the documentary, but just out of my own curiosity. So we're starting to see like a rise in lab-grown meat, like Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, things like that. From a food safety perspective, what things should consumers be on the lookout in that aspect? Because now you're not talking about ground beef, quote unquote. Do you still cook it to 155? We're talking about lab grown meat now. So what should we be on the lookout there?
So I think the things that you're going to have to be, paying attention to is you may be able to not have to be so concerned about, fecal problems like Salmonella, Campylobacter, E. coli. What I would be worried about is like Listeria. Listeria is an environmental pathogen. It loves cool, wet environments. I got to think I've never been to a place where they grow lab beef, but my guess is that it's a cool, wet environment. And, but Listeria gets into cracks and crevices and, those products become contaminated, and so I think that's one of the big risks. Same thing with, hydroponic, grown leafy greens. Is it safer to grow them indoors than outdoors across the street from a CAFO? Probably, but it doesn't mean that, you can ignore science, because the seeds can be contaminated. The seeds are raw agricultural products. The water can become contaminated. So there's different ways that, you try to solve a problem and try to then convince people that you've solved the problem and you've just made the problem, it's just different. And so, these bugs are good at doing what they do. I mean, their job is to make as many of us sick as possible. So we're delivering diarrhea and vomit as far as we can. So we make other people sick because that's what bugs want us to do, and try not to kill as many people as they can. They don't want to kill people. They want us to survive and, make other people sick. So, I think sometimes when you fix something or you think you're fixing something, you're just shifting the problem to something else. And I know that I don't mean to make that sound like, oh my God, then we're never going to solve these problems. But I think it just requires humans to think ahead of like when they're going to make a change, how that's going to impact, everything else.
So I got to tell you, Bill, this has been very depressing. Give me a glimmer of hope. I got a bag of spinach in my fridge, and I got chicken defrosting in the fridge for dinner tonight. How can I not die for dinner tonight? Give me a glimmer of hope here.
So yeah, I mean, cook the spinach. I love cooked spinach with a little lemon. It'll be great. And then, just cook your chicken to an internal temperature of 165 and you're good to go. And just be careful. Just be careful how you handle it. So, I mean, to me, one of the best scenes in the whole movie was that the scene of the mom and the little kid in the kitchen and, that I think is that is true.
I bring these packages into my house. It's really hard not to contaminate things. I'm going to open that package and I'm immediately going to put that plastic into the trash. I'm going to use my foot. And then I'm going to take the chicken, I'm going to immediately put it into, hot oil and start frying it. And then I'm going to throw away the rest of that package. But this time I touch the top of the trash can, right? And then I go to wash my hand, I turn on the faucet. I've just contaminated the faucet. I pump the soap, I've just contaminated the soap. I'm gonna wash my hands really well, and then I'm gonna rinse my hands, and I'm gonna shut off the faucet, and I've just recontaminated my hand, and I'm gonna go make a salad. As careful as I am, those bacteria get around.
That's how things happen. And that's why sometimes you can't attribute illnesses to the food that, failing to cook it. I mean, think how complex that issue was,
Yeah. That scene was very interesting.
That was really well done.
And I got to thinking about, when I work in the kitchen and I'm cooking dinner for tonight, for instance, I'm like, oh gosh, I got to be like really more self-conscious of what's going on. But Bill, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you so much for coming on the pod. Yeah, good to meet you too. Yeah. So where can people find you? How can they follow you on the social media and all that?
So I'm at marlerclark.com. We're in Seattle. I pontificate about food stuff on marlerblog.com. I urge everybody to, subscribe to Food Safety News. I'm the owner publisher, but I don't tell the folks what to write. They do their own thing, and it's a great resource for people in the industry and government. We've got it's been going since 2009. There's over 60,000 subscribers, 4 million unique visitors a month. And they do a really good job of, kind of trying to keep it down the middle on, food safety issues and making sure people are aware. So, I think you can, get some good information out there and, cook your stuff right and wash your hands. I'll leave you with that. So
that's pretty much it, right? Cook it to death and wash your hands.
Yeah, exactly. So
well, Bill, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rich. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. And if you haven't caught it on Netflix yet, the documentary is Poison, The Dirty Truth About Your Food. It was a top 10, I think, when it first came out, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was top 10 for a couple weeks. And, it was like I was having friends from, Europe and Africa saying it's like, you're the number one documentary in South Africa, or you're number one documentary in Romania. And I'm like, oh my God, that's crazy. But I think that it's died down a little bit. I think, the appetite for ruining your appetite, probably is waxed and waned a bit. But I still think it's I think it's still a good thing for consumers to watch, and I think they can learn a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And ironically, another lawyer show took over the #1 spot, Suits. I don't know if you keep up with with that kind of stuff. I thought that was kind of ironic. But again, thank you for your time. And for those out there, catch it on Netflix. It's available now to stream anywhere you get Netflix. So thank you again for your time, and have a good rest of the day.
All right, you too. Have a good weekend too.